The morning of November 19, 2005, started like any other match day in Madrid. The streets around the Santiago Bernabéu were still quiet before sunrise. But inside the stadium complex, the groundskeepers had already been working for hours. They watered the pitch, trimmed the grass to the exact regulation height, painted the touchlines bright white. The stadium was a cathedral, and in a few hours, it would hold 80,000 people who had come to witness something. They just did not know yet that what they were about to witness would be talked about for the rest of their lives. In a hotel conference room, 20 minutes from the stadium, Jose Mourinho sat at the head of a long table. He was 30, 2 days into his second season as manager of Chelsea at the time. But this was not a Chelsea match. This story does not begin with Mourinho in his usual habitat. It begins with a rumor, a conversation, a single sentence that, once spoken, could not be taken back. But before we get to that sentence, you need to understand who these two men were in the autumn of 2005, because context is everything, and without it, you cannot feel the full weight of what happened that night. Jose Mourinho, by November of 2005, was already the most arrogant, the most brilliant, and the most theatrical football manager on the planet. He had won the UEFA Champions League with Porto in 2004, an achievement so improbable that it had announced him to the world like a cannon shot. He had then moved to Chelsea, backed by Roman Abramovich's money, and turned the Premier League into his personal property. He called himself the Special One in his very first press conference at Chelsea. The media laughed. Then he won the league. Then he won it again. Nobody was laughing anymore. Mourinho did not just want to win matches. He wanted to control every conversation around football. He wanted the psychological space, the mental territory, before a single ball was kicked. He studied opponents obsessively. He watched footage until his eyes burned. And he talked. He talked more than almost any manager before him, and every single word was calculated. Ronaldinho Gacho, by November of 2005, was simply the best footballer alive on planet Earth. There was no serious debate about this. He had won the Ballon d'Or in 2004. He would win it again in 2005. He was playing for Barcelona under Frank Rijkaard, and that Barcelona side, built around Ronaldinho at its absolute center, was the most beautiful football machine in the world. Xavi Hernandez was the metronome. Andres Iniesta was the ghost drifting between the lines. Samuel Eto'o was the blade up front. But Ronaldinho was the soul. He was the reason people stopped whatever they were doing and turned to face the television. He was born Ronaldo Assis Moreira in Porto Alegre, in the south of Brazil, in 1980. He grew up in Vila Nova, a neighborhood where football was not a dream or a hobby. It was the language everyone spoke. He played in the streets before he played on grass. He learned how to manipulate a ball in spaces so tight that the skill translated, later in his career, into an ability to make defenders look like furniture. He arrived in Europe via Paris Saint-Germain, then moved to Barcelona in 2003. And within 12 months he had transformed a club that had been stumbling into something that made the rest of Europe feel genuinely inadequate. Now, here is what you need to know about the El Clasico of November 19, 2005, before the rumor entered the story. El Clasico, the match between Real Madrid and Barcelona, is not a football match. It is a civilization compressed into 90 minutes. It carries the weight of history, of politics, of identity, of language and pride and memory and grief. Real Madrid had spent the previous several years building what the press called the Galacticos, a collection of the most famous players on Earth, assembled for maximum global impact: Zinedine Zidane, David Beckham, Ronaldo, Luis Figo. These were not just footballers, they were brands, monuments, symbols. But by November of 2005, the Galacticos project was straining. Results were inconsistent. The dressing room had tensions. And Barcelona, led by Ronaldinho, had started to make Real Madrid look old-fashioned, like a museum of famous names rather than a living, breathing football team. So the pressure in Madrid before this particular Clasico was immense. Now the rumor. In the days before the match, something leaked. Whether it was a training ground conversation that someone overheard, or whether a staff member passed information to a journalist, or whether it was something that emerged from a tactical discussion that was not meant to leave the room, nobody ever confirmed the exact source. But the substance of what leaked was this: in a conversation about how to neutralize Barcelona's attacking threat, someone in a position of authority had said words to the effect that Ronaldinho was not a real tactical problem, that he was a showman, that his tricks and his elasticos and his no-look passes were entertainment, not football, that you should not fear a player who performed for the crowd rather than for the result. One version of what was said, and the version that spread fastest because it was the most vivid and the most cutting, was this: Ronaldinho is just a clown. He performs. He does not compete. Now, this sentence, or something very close to it, began moving through Madrid. It moved from conversation to conversation. It appeared in fragments in Spanish newspapers. It reached the ears of journalists who covered Barcelona. And eventually, inevitably, it reached the Barcelona camp. And then it reached Ronaldinho. Nobody who was in the Barcelona dressing room that week has ever given a precise account of the moment Ronaldinho heard what had been said. The details depend on who is telling the story and when, but several accounts agree on the essential shape of what happened. Ronaldinho was told. He listened. He did not raise his voice. He did not express anger in any visible or dramatic way. He did not call a press conference and deliver a furious rebuttal. He did not send a message through intermediaries. He did not post anything. He did not speak to journalists. He just smiled. And that smile, according to people who saw it that week, was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed exactly what he needed. The morning of November 19 arrived. Barcelona traveled to Madrid with a squad that included some of the finest players of their generation. But the mood around the team was built almost entirely on what Ronaldinho was going to do. His teammates knew him well enough to understand that something had shifted. There was a quality in the way he moved through training that final week, a precision inside the freedom, a deliberateness hidden beneath the joy, that told the people watching him that he had locked onto something and was not going to let go. The Santiago Bernabéu began filling around 2 hours before kickoff. 80,000 people, most of them in white, filling every tier of one of the most intimidating stadiums on earth. The noise at El Clasico is different from the noise at other matches. It has a particular frequency, a combination of hatred and love and expectation and anxiety that can be physically felt in the chest. Real Madrid supporters are not passive. They boo opposition players during warm-ups. They whistle at their own players when performances disappoint. They are a crowd that has opinions and expresses them without restraint. When Barcelona came out for their warm-up, the whistles started almost immediately. This was normal. This was expected. And for Ronaldinho, walking out under those floodlights, hearing 80,000 people signal their opposition, it was not a threat. It was an invitation. The match kicked off. For the first 10 minutes, it was tight, fractured, interrupted. Tackles came in hard. The midfield was congested. Both sides were feeling for the other's weaknesses, searching for the angle of attack. Real Madrid pressed high, trying to prevent Barcelona from building from the back. Barcelona, patient and organized, kept their shape and waited. And then, in the 14th minute, something happened. Ronaldinho received the ball wide on the left side of Real Madrid's half. He had 2 defenders within 5 meters of him. The angle to goal was poor. The sensible option was to lay the ball off, keep possession, wait for the structure to open. Any reasonable footballer, any player who was merely very good, rather than what Ronaldinho was, would have made the safe pass. Instead, Ronaldinho took one touch to set the ball, dropped his shoulder to the right, watched the defender commit, and then moved left with a speed and smoothness that looked, in real time, like something that should not be physically possible. One defender was gone. The second tried to cover and was left grasping at air. Ronaldinho was now in space, and he hit a pass so perfectly weighted, so precisely angled, that it split the entire Real Madrid defensive line and found Samuel Eto'o in a position where he only had to touch it into the net. 1-0 to Barcelona. The Bernabéu fell quiet for a moment in the way that large crowds go quiet when they have seen something they did not expect. Then the Real Madrid supporters found their voice again and pushed back. Real Madrid responded. They equalized. The match became level. The noise returned to its normal furious pitch, and at halftime it was 1 goal each. A fair reflection of a match that had been, up to that point, even. In the dressing rooms at halftime, both teams regrouped. In the Barcelona dressing room, Rijkaard was calm and methodical. He made adjustments. He spoke about shape and positioning. And Ronaldinho sat with his boots on, drinking water, saying almost nothing. His expression was composed. He had played very well in the first half, but he had not yet done what he had decided he was going to do that evening. The second half began. Within minutes, the match shifted. Barcelona began to find more space. Real Madrid's defensive structure, stretched by Barcelona's movement and passing, started to develop gaps. And Ronaldinho, moving between positions, drifting from the left to the center to the right, was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Then came the moment that the entire football world saw in the days and weeks that followed. Ronaldinho was 40 meters from goal, near the center circle, with his back to the Real Madrid penalty area. A Real Madrid midfielder came to press him. Ronaldinho received the ball, and in a single motion that lasted perhaps 1.5 seconds, he turned, spotted the run of a teammate, and clipped a pass over the top of the entire Real Madrid defensive line with the outside of his right foot. The pass was not just accurate. It was disguised in a way that made it look, until the very last fraction of a second, like he was going to do something completely different. The defender who was pressing him had no chance to intercept, because the decision had already been made before any defender could read it. The pass led to a chance. The chance became a goal. Barcelona were ahead again, 2-1. And then, in the 76th minute, came the moment that no one in that stadium, and no one watching on television around the world, would ever fully forget. Ronaldinho collected the ball on the left side of the box. He had one thought, and one thought only. He drove toward the penalty area with the ball at his feet, shifting it from left to right with a rhythm that the defender trying to mark him simply could not read. Then he shot. It was a fierce, curling drive that moved through the air in a trajectory that the goalkeeper could track but could not reach. The ball hit the back of the net, 3-1. Ronaldinho's second goal of the match. The Santiago Bernabéu fell into an almost complete silence for a full second. And then, something extraordinary happened. Something that had almost never happened in the long and turbulent history of El Clasico. The Real Madrid supporters began to applaud. 80,000 people in white. People who had come to this stadium to support their team and oppose Barcelona, people who had whistled Ronaldinho during the warm-up, began to clap. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the sound was unmistakable, and it grew, and it became a standing ovation. For a player in a Barcelona shirt, at the Bernabéu, in the middle of El Clasico, Ronaldinho standing in front of the Barcelona fans who had made the journey from the Catalan capital, turned and pumped his fist toward them. Then, almost immediately, he looked toward the other end of the stadium, where the Real Madrid supporters were applauding, and he smiled. Not the smile of mockery, not the smile of contempt. The smile of someone who had just completed something he had set out to do, and who understood the full meaning of what had just happened. Real Madrid's players did not argue with the supporters who were clapping. They understood what they had just witnessed. After the final whistle, the Barcelona players celebrated 3-1, a famous, complete, overwhelming victory at the most difficult stadium in the world. In the tunnel, the two sets of players exchanged the usual words. Some handshakes were warmer than others. In the press conference room, a journalist asked about the quote, about the words that had been circulating in the days before the match, about the suggestion that Ronaldinho was a performer for the crowd rather than a true competitor. The response from the person in the room was a long pause, and then a non-answer, a deflection, a refusal to engage with the substance of the question. Because there was nothing to say. The match had already answered. In the Barcelona dressing room afterward, Ronaldinho showered and changed, and received his teammates with the same warmth he always brought to those moments. He was not triumphant in a way that pointed at anyone. He did not make speeches. He did not reference what had been said about him. He talked about the game, about the moments that had worked, about what he had felt in specific situations. But when a journalist, who had been allowed brief access to the dressing room, caught him alone for 30 seconds and asked him directly about the clown comment, whether he had heard it, whether it had motivated him, Ronaldinho paused for a moment. Then he said something simple. He said, "I just played football," and smiled again. That same smile. What happened in the days following that match was a kind of collective reckoning with what had been witnessed. Television channels across Europe replayed the goals. Newspapers ran columns trying to put language to what Ronaldinho had done. The standing ovation, that extraordinary moment of a hostile crowd involuntarily paying tribute to the enemy, became the central image of every discussion. But beneath all of that was the other story. The story about the comment and the response, and the way those two things connected, because Ronaldinho had not responded to being called a clown by making a speech. He had not responded by complaining to the media. He had not responded by seeking sympathy or attempting to change the narrative with words. He had responded by walking into the most intimidating football arena in the world, in the most important match in the football calendar, against the most famous club on earth, and playing the most complete and dazzling performance of the entire season. Maybe of several seasons. He had responded by making 80,000 hostile witnesses stand up and clap for him. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a perfect answer. It is different from the silence that follows an argument, one on points, or a silence that comes from exhaustion. It is the silence that arrives when there is simply nothing left to say, because the thing that needed to be demonstrated has been demonstrated so completely that words feel embarrassing by comparison. That is the silence that fell after November 19, 2005, and in football circles, in the years that followed, when the conversation turned to Ronaldinho. People often mentioned that night at the Bernabéu, not just for the goals or for the ovation, but for the story underneath the story. For the fact that someone had looked at the most joyful, the most creative, the most free footballer on earth and decided that freedom meant shallowness. That joy meant a lack of seriousness. That the smile meant absence of will. And Ronaldinho had walked onto a pitch and proved, without saying a single word, that every single one of those assumptions was wrong. The truly great ones do not argue. They do not explain. They do not wait for the right moment to make their case in a press conference or an interview. They wait for the moment when the lights are brightest and the stage is largest and the opposition is at its most formidable. And then they play. Ronaldinho was many things. He was the son of a factory worker from Porto Alegre, who died when Ronaldinho was 8 years old, and whose absence shaped him in ways that ran deeper than any statistic or match report could capture. He was a brother, a teammate, a man who brought other players into moments of laughter during the most pressurized situations imaginable. He was a genius, in the old and precise sense of the word, a man through whom something larger than himself seemed to move when conditions were right. He was also a human being with flaws and vulnerabilities, and periods of his career that did not match the heights of those years at Barcelona. But on that November evening, in a stadium full of people who had come hoping to see him fail, Ronaldinho was something very specific. He was the answer. And the answer was yes. Yes, he competed. Yes, he cared about the result. Yes. Behind the elasticos and the back heels and the grinning improvisation was a will of iron and a preparation so deep that even his opponents' dressing rooms could not contain the intelligence of it. The clown, as someone had called him, went to the Bernabéu, and the Bernabéu stood up. That is not something that happens by accident. That is not something that happens because a player is merely skilled, or merely fast, or merely in form. That happens when a player has understood something about the relationship between freedom and discipline, between joy and seriousness, between performance and competition, that most players never fully grasp. Ronaldinho understood that the smile was not separate from the will. The joy was not separate from the desire to win. The trick was not separate from the tactic. They were the same thing, expressed in the same action, inseparable and mutually reinforcing. He did not play despite caring. He played the way he played because he cared more deeply than the people watching could fully comprehend. And on the night that someone tried to reduce him to a clown, he chose the only response that mattered. He played. And the cathedral in Madrid, full of people who loved the rival and wanted the dream to die, discovered that some things are too beautiful to resist. Even when you are trying to. Especially when you are trying to.